Hey guys, Red02 here, back at it again for another transaxle locking video. First we did the wheel horse transaxle, then the 633As, and now we're going to do the Peerless 2300. This is a 4-speed, 1 reverse, and no high-low range, but it is a very stout, heavy-duty transaxle. It's cast iron housing, big axles, axle shafts. They're really strong, and this is going to be the first time I lock this one. They came in some Murrays. I actually have a Dynamark with one of these in it, and a few other tractors, but yeah, so let's get into this detailed video on how to lock this transaxle, and hopefully this helps you guys. Just like any other transaxle, before you go ahead and pull it apart, you want to pressure wash or wash this up, scrub it real nice and clean so whenever you pop the case apart, no dirt gets on the inside. Then you got to go ahead and get your wheel hubs off, and these were aluminum, so I had to be careful. I had to heat them up with a torch and pop them off. They were seized on there. You just got to be careful you don't go ahead and melt that aluminum. The brake shaft came right off. It's just a snap ring, it popped right off, and then the input pulley has some splines on it with a, I believe, a 9/16 bolt. Just popped that off. That slid right off. So now we can go ahead and start tearing this thing apart. Gonna go ahead and take off the shifter, make sure she's in neutral. That pops right out. After the shifter's out, you want to go ahead and make some marks on the axle tubes so that way you can see which way they go back on, because they got to go back on the same way they came off, and they have to go back on the same side they came off. So we'll go ahead and get these 8 bolts out, 4 on each side. You also want to make sure the axle shafts are nice and smooth and there's no gouges or rust on them, so whenever you pop off these tubes they come off a little bit easier. We got the bolts out, so we'll tap it with the rubber mallet and see if we can pop those off nicely. There goes one tube. I think the axle's coming out. Oh, it's weird. Oh, that popped that one loose. It's quite odd. The diff floats back and forth. I just took some pieces of scrap metal to prop that up off that brake shaft. And you want the case having that has the input shaft along with the shifter location cast into the casing facing upwards. You do not want to take it apart flipped around the other way. But there's 2 dowel pins in here in between the casings. One right here on the bottom side underneath the axle, and one up here up by the shifter. You want to take a punch and a hammer and pop those out just to make it a little bit easier for you to get these 2 apart once all the bolts are out. Just like any other case, you want to go ahead and take a flathead screwdriver or some sort of thin chisel and work your way around and just try and sneak it in between the 2 casings. Lightly tap it until it pops loose, and then you can pry it all the way around. Now, I've never done this one before, but from what I see in the manual, this input shaft is connected to this top housing. So what you have to do is you have to lift up about 1.5 inches to 2 inches and rotate this about 45 degrees and spin it a little bit to get it to come off. And that seems like that worked out good. Now you want to check for your thrust washers, make sure they're all intact so that way you don't lose any down in the casings. So that is the interior of a 2300. And I guess the reason why you had to lift up and twist that case at an angle is because this casting in the housing is a support for this little shaft down here, and it has to come up past those gears. Definitely an interesting interior. So we'll go ahead and try and pull that axle out. Hopefully that comes out fairly easy, and then we can set all this stuff aside and tear that diff apart. Hopefully I don't drop this on the ground, and that came out a lot easier than I thought it was going to. Now that I got this axle out, this looks oddly similar to what is in the Peerless 820 transaxles. We'll pull these 8 bolts out. This carrier and bowl gear look pretty much identical to an 820. The diff blown apart, and this is pretty much a Peerless 820. But there's a good possibility you could go ahead and put a solid axle in this thing, but we're not going to do that. What we're going to do is we're going to go ahead, weld these gears to this pin, and then we'll probably fill in some of these gears and some of the gears on the axle just to get a little bit more solid of a locker for them. I figured this would be best to show you the wheel horse, the 633As, those differentials, you can weld them while they're bolted together on this 2300. It's basically a Peerless 820 differential, so you have to weld it outside of the differential housing. So there's a snap ring that holds on this spider gear to the axle, and there's a thrust washer, then the spider gear. Just trying to pop this off. The spider gear, and then there's a spacer on the back side here. Just push that spacer back on the axle and just set the thrust washer back on there, and then get the axle out of your way. This is what a Peerless 2300 differential looks like, all blown apart. Now what you want to do is you want to go ahead and clean these parts all with either unchlorinated brake clean or some sort of degreaser, and make sure you get all the oil off of these, because whenever you go ahead to weld these, you can't have any sort of contaminants or else you will not get a good weld. Now this is how I set these differentials up. You obviously do not have to do it this way. With a differential like this, you can go ahead and do per se a dock locker. If you're not familiar with Sprocket's Garage on YouTube, he created his own non-welded or welded style locker with a solid axle. That would probably work on this differential, but this is how I do it. So you get your center pin, you put both your spider gears on there, your spacer block thingamabobs, slide that down into the diff, and then spread your gears out all the way. And then what I do, you set these gears up the same exact way. You leave a space open up here and a space here. You don't have one with a tooth in the center and a space over here, or else your other spider gears will not line up. So if you make both of these have an open area at the top, let the other two gear tips rest on the bench or whatever work surface you're using, excuse me, and then you can tack weld these on either side, pop this out from the gear, and fully weld them. So I got a little bit carried away with myself, but so this is your finished locker, and this is good for maybe up to a medium aggressive 25-inch tire, as long as you're not popping the clutch super crazy or anything like that. Now, not to say that it won't hold up, I got one of these bad boys in my Peerless 820 in my mud Dynamark. This thing weighs just about 500 pounds. It has 24 by 11 by 10 swamp witches on the rear. I wheelie this thing, completely clutch drop this thing, full revs, high gear, and it's been going on 2-3 years now and no issues. So I'm not telling you that this is going to hold up to everything you do in a 2300 series, but it's held out tremendously for me in the past. Being as this Murray is very, very heavy and it's running a 25-inch tire on the rear, I'm going to do a little bit extra. This is the locker and how I made you line up the gears so that they're equally lined up, and we got an axle shaft gear here. Now you can see I have these 2 blue lines marked out, and I started welding where the line ends on both ends. I'm going to do the same over here, and we're going to actually fill these full in with weld, because you set that gear on there that's where that locker rides. So if for some reason, what I'm going to do is I'm going to weld in those 4 locations all the way around, grind them down smooth so that those voids are fully solidly filled in. So what that's going to do is, if for some reason there's too much stress and this pin goes to break, that gear is going to try and twist and it's not going to be able to move, because it's going to hit that weld and it's not going to be able to spin. It's just a little bit extra precaution, as that this is not my machine and I don't want it to break at all. This is what you end up with. This is your locker. So you have your counter shaft that you welded of course it's not going to focus, that you welded the counter shaft gears to the pin, and then you went ahead, and this is just crudely done, so welded in your spots and your gear fits right in there. And then you take your other one with the 2 spots and drop down on there, and that's what your diff looks like. So just to make this a little bit easier, I put blue marks on the gears, so they have to be straight up and down whenever we go ahead and put this diff together, or else it won't line up properly, along with the blue marks on this axle shaft. So let's see if I can get this thing together on camera for you. So let's see if we could do this the correct way. Where's my blue lines at? Yeah, right like that. Got the diff all welded up, and we're going to start putting this transaxle back together. You see there's no bolt heads on this side, bolt heads on this side. The bolt heads face up. So we're just going to slide that down in there until it pops. I did go ahead and put a nice thin layer of RTV silicone on this gasket. You're not supposed to do that. If it has a gasket, you do not use RTV, but this is what I do on all my stuff. So just a little extra precaution, since I'm reusing the old gasket. You're actually supposed to replace all the gaskets whenever you tear this thing apart, but we're building off-road lawnmowers. We're too cheap for that. Now, this is my first Peerless 2300, so we'll see if we can get this case half back on without any issues. I missed a little bit of oil. I'm wiping off the top case half, but there's this little ear in the case here that has to sneak around these gears, so we'll see if we can get it on. Supposed to I believe it's the shift shafts that are holding me up. So I think the shift forks in here are what's holding me up. So I just got a little 90-degree pick, and I'm going to try and pull them towards me a little bit. And that's what it was. Case is all seated down on itself. Time to put the bolts back in. Actually, before we put the bolts in, I'm gonna tap these dowel pins back in, just so that the case halves are completely lined up and all the gears are meshing correctly. I don't know if you saw that on camera, but it shifted the case over a little bit, so they were obviously not lined up exactly where they were supposed to be, and that's exactly why those dowel pins are in there. Got all the case half bolts together, and now it's time for the axle shafts housings. One of these bearings was actually froze up, so I popped off this seal, unfroze it, greased both of them up. But I'm going to line up my two red marks that I made before, which goes on this axle side. Right like that. Put the bolts in, do the same for the other side, and then we can put the shifter back in. Got both the axle housings bolted back on. Time to put the shifter back in there. And there you have it, a Peerless 2300 locked and ready to go back in the tractor. I just have to replace this brake shaft seal, fill it up with some gear oil, give it a fresh coat of paint, and then I can slap it back into Doug's tractor. Hopefully this helps you out with your locking process on your Peerless 2300. If you haven't seen already, I did one on a wheel horse transaxle along with the Roper 633A, most commonly found in the Sears Suburbans, the older Sears, and the Craftsman GT line. And if anyone needs one, we'll do maybe the Peerless 820 next, or an MST 205, 206 locker, something like that. So let me know if you would like to see a video on that. But other than that, hopefully this helped you out, and have a wonderful day.